Hello friends, and welcome to Ars Amalia, a place where we talk about historical fiber arts. Today I want to talk to you about Elizabethan plaited braid stitch. I've been delving into Elizabethan style embroidery lately, and I thought it would be fun to share with you a tutorial on how to make this stitch because it can look a little odd when you first are trying to figure it out. The method that I'm going to be showing you today is from a fantastic book, Elizabethan Stitches by Jackie Carey. So just one quick note, you're going to notice that there are no stitch diagrams in this tutorial, and that's because that's the intellectual property of Jackie Carey. And if you want to see stitch diagrams, I would highly recommend that you get yourself a copy of this book. She talks about not only plaited braid stitch, but a whole bunch of other Elizabethan gold work, Elizabethan needle lace, and even more Elizabethan period stitches. So this is a fantastic resource for all of you Elizabethan embroidery aficionados out there. First, let's talk a little bit about the historical context of this stitch. Elizabethan plaited braid stitch is a type of goldwork stitch, and actually it's part of a larger category of looped braided stitches that we see a lot in Tudor and specifically Elizabethan embroidery. So this stitch we see a lot in the latter half of the 16th century and the first half of the 17th century. The first example of this stitch that I have been able to find in our extant pieces is actually a little book cover that Queen Elizabeth herself made when she was a girl. This was a book cover that she made as a gift for her stepmother, Catherine Parr, one of the many wives of Henry VIII. And she made this around 1544. It's in the 1544-1545 gift roll list. This stitch was really popular, as I said, in the latter half of the 16th century and in the beginning of the 17th century. You see it on coifs, you see it on sweet bags, you see it on jackets, you see it on a whole bunch of different types of domestic embroidery. One of the interesting things about this stitch is that you use so much gold to make just a small length of this stitch. And so actually the needlework historian Tricia Nguyen has theorized that this was a way to store wealth in your needlework. There was no centralized banking in England at this point, so if you've got to put your money somewhere, why not put it in some pretty clothes with lots of fancy gold thread? Before I show you how to do the actual stitch, I just want to give you a quick heads up on some materials that you might find helpful as you're trying to give this a go yourself. So just a quick background on some goldwork threads. This stitch is best done with a goldwork thread called passing thread. Another thread that looks a lot like passing thread is called Japan thread. And there's an important distinction between these two threads that will make the difference between you loving this stitch and you wanting to throw your stitching against the wall and never do it again. And that is that passing thread is made up of very thin strips of metal that are wrapped around a fiber core. Japan thread traditionally is descended from a group of threads called membrane threads, which were made by gilding an animal membrane of some kind, parchment or hide or something like that, that was cut into thin strips, and that was wound around a fiber core. As you can probably imagine, you can get metal thinner than you can cut strips of an animal product. So the strips of metal in passing thread are a lot narrower than the strips of paper, or today mylar, that you'll see on Japan thread. So the Japan thread will tend to kink up as you pass it through the fabric, and it doesn't take the narrow, very tight curves as well as passing thread. That's not to say that Japan thread is a bad material. It works beautifully in Japanese embroidery and in other goldwork techniques where surface couching is the main type of goldwork being done. However, when you need to pass thread through the fabric, you'll find that the Japan thread, it might kink up oddly, it might even shred on you, and it won't take the tight curves as well as passing thread. A good inexpensive alternative to real metal passing thread is a thread called 371. This is a synthetic metal thread made by Benton & Johnson, which is a metal thread manufacturing company over in the UK. Instead of using a strip of real gold, there's a synthetic material that's wound around a fiber core. But like passing thread, it's very thin, and so it passes through the fabric quite successfully. And I have had great success practicing with this gold thread. So I highly recommend using this stuff before you attempt to use the good stuff. Just a quick word about the materials that you're going to see today before I get going with the actual tutorial, just so that you're not confused. The fabric I'm using, this is just blue plain old cotton fabric, and I am using white cotton knitting yarn, simply because that is easier for you to see on camera. As you're practicing these stitches, you're going to want to use something probably much smaller than this cotton yarn. It's so thick, it's actually quite difficult to pull through this blue fabric, which you'll see in a moment. So you want to use something that's not quite this thick, but something that has a good amount of body. A nice cheap alternative is actually to get some thick, like upholstery weight thread and run it through beeswax a bunch of times. And that will give it kind of the stiffness that you often see in gold threads. Before we get into how to start this stitch, I thought it would be helpful to go over the basic steps involved in making the stitch. So there are 3 basic stages of how you form this stitch, and only one of those goes through the fabric, and you'll see what I mean in just a moment. So before we get started with the stitching, I just want to go over some anatomy of this stitch. So you'll notice we have the stitch that goes through the fabric, and then we have these sort of V's that run through the center, and then we have these loops on the outside. So these are the loops. And then if I tuck away these stitches, you'll see on the side we have these legs. I'm going to call them legs for the purpose of this video. So we have 1 leg and 2 legs. So each stitch makes essentially a leg that's hidden by these loops on the side. And the other side has exactly that same thing. So here's a bunch of legs. And this new stitch will create a new leg. So let's get started forming this stitch. So we've just passed through the fabric, and again, you'll see that step in just a minute. We are going to go over this loop on top. Now I am going to turn away these loops on top so you can see the legs underneath. So we're going under the first leg and the second leg here. So that's 2 stitches that we're going underneath. Here we go. And I find sometimes this top loop gets a little bit lost in the stitch, so I like to just take a minute to fluff that up. Here we go. And now we are going to form a circle all the way around. This becomes the new loop on the top. So now I'm going to peel away the loops here, and you'll see we have 1 leg and 2 legs, and we're going to start under the second leg here. And now, this is a little bit tricky to do with yarn, but it's not as tricky to do with your gold thread. We are going to end up passing over that loop that we passed over in the beginning also. So the needle is passing over that initial loop. So again, this is about to become the new loop. We're passing over the old loop. And then as I tighten, you don't want to tighten this loop too much. If you tighten it too much, then the stitch gets out of whack, and you create some wonky tension. What I like for this loop is for it to be sitting just above the 2 legs that pass through the fabric. So it's kind of making a little halo for those legs. And now to keep the next stitch parallel, so if we're going in a straight line, we want our stitches through the fabric to be parallel. So I sometimes like to just peel away that loop that we just made so I can see where the stitch inserts into the fabric. So now, after we just did 2 loops, one going this way and one going all the way around, after those 2 loops is when we actually pass through the fabric. Yarn is very difficult to get through fabric, so I apologize that I'm fighting in this step. Here we go. And we'll pull this through. And this you can pull pretty much all the way through. Again, we don't want to pull it tight, but we're not trying to create a loop with this step. So I'm going to show you all three of those steps one more time. So we have this loop here that we just created in the last stitch. We're going to go over this loop. I'm going to peel away those loops. We're going to go under the two legs, the first two legs. And now, if you look through Elizabethan stitches, you'll notice that there are some variations of this stitch. I'm showing you what Jackie Carey is calling the standard version of Elizabethan plaited braid. Other stitches might go under 3 stitches. I believe that's one of the variations. So that is how you change up this stitch. But for our purposes, for the standard plaited braid, we are going under 2 legs right here. So, and this one you can pull all the way through also. We only have one step, that's the loop step, and that's this second step here. So we've looped it around. We're going under the 2 legs. But again, first I like to fluff up that center rung. And this is a step that will be easier to see when you are not using very large knitting yarn. So we're going under these 2 rungs, and then we are going over this center loop. I'm going to tilt that up so you can see a little better. We are going over this loop right here. Here we go. And as the last step, we are going to pass the needle through our fabric. So those are the basics of plaited braid stitch. Now that you've gotten a taste for how this stitch is constructed, I'm going to show you how to get started. So you can see we have here our center line of stitching. So this is our basic guide. Some people put 2 lines for either side of the stitch. I like to mark just a center line, which is actually going to be the center of the stitch. And most of our stitches are not actually going to fall on this center line. However, the very first stitch that we take as we come up through the fabric from the bottom is actually going to be along this center line. So we're going to take this first stitch. Regardless of whether you are right or left-handed, this is how this stitch begins. Now you're going to take one of those horizontal stitches. So this is exactly the same kind of stitch that you saw as we were forming the stitch earlier. And here, this stitch we can pull all the way through. We're not trying to create a loop yet with this stitch. So again, you don't want to pull it tight, but you just want to pull it so that it lays nicely on the fabric. So now we're going to enter our needle through this stitch. And now we are going to create a loop with our working thread. So we are going all the way around, and I'll follow that with my thread. And now we're going to pass the needle under this new loop that was just created and over our working thread. So we're basically making a circle and then securing it in place. So now we have the beginnings of our stitch. So now we can begin creating the stitch just like we were before. So we will take, again, our horizontal stitch, onto our fabric. So you can see we already have that first loop that we go over. And now if we flip it over to the side, we currently only have 2 rungs here, one up here and one down here, but that's all we need to create the stitch. We're going under 2 here. So that's our first pass. And again, that one does not pass through the fabric, that is only going through the thread. And I'm going to fluff up my loop here on the top. There we go, that's a little clearer with that loop. Now we are going to loop our thread around to the other side, and we will find those 2 rungs on this side. Here we have 1 and 2 right here. We're coming up under the bottom rung, the bottom of the 2, and then we are stitching again over that loop, and now we are passing through, and we're creating a new loop, and we just keep on going from here. And I always like to end with the stitch that goes through the fabric, because then I always know what step I'm on before I start the next steps. Now that you understand the basics of how this stitch is constructed, I want to talk a little bit about how you can control the size and shape of this stitch. The spacing you use is going to depend largely on the size of the thread that you're using. So obviously right now I'm using yarn, so my spacing is going to be much, much larger than when I'm using the gold threads. However, I do find that the ratios of the sizes tend to stay the same. What I mean by that is I tend to like to have the equivalent of 2 lengths of my thread space between the vertical stitches, and I tend to like to have about 3 lengths of thread between the horizontal stitches. So for me personally, that ends up in a pleasing stitch shape for me. When I use those ratios of size, I tend to get a nice tight V shape while still preserving the loop shape. If you space your horizontal stitches farther apart, you're going to get a loopier shape. Also, if you change the tightness of your tension when doing the loop step, you can get a loopier shape. So, for example, if I were to not pull this loop as tight, we would get a different shape to the stitch. So those are all things to take into consideration when you're thinking about how you want to shape your stitch. So I highly recommend, before you get started stitching on whatever your final piece is, that you actually practice on a little sampler or just a scrap of fabric to help you determine what the ratios are going to be for your stitch. And by ratios, I mean how far apart are your horizontal stitches, how far apart are your vertical stitches, and how tightly are you going to pull the thread tension when you're doing the loop step. You may recall from the historical context portion of this video that I said that this stitch requires a lot of gold thread to complete. So you're probably going to find yourself having to start and stop your gold threads a lot over the course of this stitch. Thankfully, that is actually one of the easiest parts of this stitch to do. All you have to do is, after you have finished the loop step of the braid, which is what I have been calling step 2, when it comes time to pass your needle through the fabric, instead of passing it through once and then coming up through a second hole, you're simply going to pass it through the fabric, and pull your thread to the back. And now you can simply weave that end in on the back. To start a new thread, simply cut a new length of thread, tie a knot, and bring it back up where your second hole would be. And that is how you stop an old thread and start a new one. When it comes time to finish your stitching, you end the stitch very similarly to what we just did when you start and end a new thread. However, instead of ending your thread to one side, you might play around with instead inserting your needle right in the center and pulling it through. And that just creates a little bit more of a symmetrical look to the finished braid. And that stitch can be closer to the loop or farther away, depending on your taste. And you'll just weave that end in along the bottom. The last thing I want to show you about plaited braid stitch is how to do it in a curve, because that is the manifestation we often see of this stitch in Elizabethan embroidery pieces. So here, I have left off the stitch after doing our initial pass through and the loop around. So now we've come to this stage to take the stitch through the fabric. So I had mentioned previously that to do a straight line, you're going to create a series of parallel lines with that stitch that you take through the fabric. When we are going in a circle, what we're going to do is fan out those lines. So instead of making them parallel, they are going to fan out around the center of this circle. Or in many cases, not quite a full circle, usually 2/3 or 3/4 or something like that. So you'll notice, here's the angle of our previous line. We're going to ever so slightly shift it so that these are a little bit closer together than these stitches. That is how we accomplish a circular shape. I hope this little tutorial helped give you a better idea of how to do this stitch yourself, and also a few tips and tricks on how to use this successfully in an embroidery piece. If you have any questions about this stitch, feel free to leave them in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video and subscribe to my channel if you are interested in learning more about historical fiber techniques. And now, my friends, go forth